SECfans.com, week 13. Georgia is still hanging around. Y'all don't be too sad about that Auburn loss. You still got a shot at the CFP. We're going to talk about you this week. You got a big game against Georgia Tech. I know Georgia Tech coming in at 5-5, not as much shine on this game as usually is, but it's still a rivalry game, and Georgia Tech is still that team that can come up and snap you every once in a while. So it's a different look for Georgia, and when everybody talks about it, anytime somebody plays a Georgia Tech or a Navy, they talk about that defensively, how you have to prepare. Before we get into this game, we're going to be mostly Georgia fans. I know some Tech fans are on there too. Shout out to William. Let's talk about what happened to Georgia in this Auburn game. I tweeted earlier this week. Well, it's Sunday, so I tweeted late last week. Everybody's sleeping on Georgia now because of what happened in this Auburn game. Forgetting the fact that all the other one-loss teams like your Oklahomas and your Clemsons and your Ohio States, who's a two-loss team, they've all lost to unranked teams. Clemson lost to a 4-7 team. Georgia lost to number 6 Auburn and has been steamrolling everybody all year. So is it too early for us to forget about Georgia, given the fact that they've already got their ticket punched for Atlanta?
Well, I mean, it obviously is, from the sense that they have one game to play, that if they win that game, assuming they beat Georgia Tech, they go to the playoff. Like, they have one ranked game to play for it all. It's all locked up. Anything can happen every Saturday, if nothing else from that perspective. But I don't know that I've ever seen so much where a team dominates the entire year and they have one bad game and they're buried. Just buried. It's absurd. And it's absurd on a lot of levels, just from the fact that there were a lot of things that kind of went against Georgia in that game. Untimely turnovers. Georgia came out of the gate firing. Then they slowed down. I think there's a lot of concerns with that game. I think there's a lot to understand with why people don't think at this point that Georgia is going to be successful if they play Alabama or Auburn again. But at the same time, we know how Georgia does against Auburn. Alabama's favored against Auburn. If Alabama beats Auburn, it's a different matchup if Georgia plays Alabama. They have different strengths and weaknesses. We don't know what that game looks like. So it's absolutely too early, and I'm not just saying that, and I am kind of a grim reaper, as many Georgia fans who've watched the show are well aware. You don't bury a team that fast, and you can't take that much out of a game that is that uncharacteristic. And I guess I'll say this one more thing with that. I don't think anybody really buys that LSU is a better football team than Georgia on a continual basis. I don't think people buy that Texas A&M is a better team than Georgia, or that Ole Miss was a better team. Frankly, those games were all closer or were losses for Auburn than the Georgia game was. And I point that out to note, at some level, what happened with the Georgia-Auburn game was as much uncharacteristic for Auburn as it was for Georgia, in that they don't normally beat teams by those margins as much as Georgia doesn't lose them. So I think there's a lot of hope there. I think if you can sort of keep from getting discouraged, and I think there's a lot of takeaways to look forward to the future, but I wouldn't bury Georgia yet.
And we're going to talk about what we think about Georgia versus Georgia Tech in the matchups here, but I want to let you spin a little bit on this scenario. I've also said over the last week that if Auburn beats Alabama, it is not crazy to think that Georgia could win that game in Atlanta. Talk about that for a minute.
The Georgia-Auburn game really went off the rails because you had a true freshman quarterback in an extremely hostile environment that was asked to pick up the slack to an incredible degree. And they got down in that game really pretty quickly, but I felt like at the end of the first half, when they had the punt return that set them up in scoring position, if they had just called sort of sane plays and tried to get some yardage and set up a field goal, they were going to be absolutely in that ball game. If you go in 10-16 at the half, everything's in pretty good shape, and I felt like that was going to be a close game. But the fact that they, kicked a field goal with time expiring, kind of bafflingly and missed it, it suddenly changed basically the whole makeup in the game, in my view. And then you have, Auburn gets the ball. They get to the 47-yard line. They end up punting it, and Georgia fumbles the football. Auburn turns around, scores, and suddenly it's 23-7. So you had really, it was broken up by the break, but back-to-back mistakes at the end of the first half and the start of the second half that took a game that could have been a 3-point game and turned it into a 16-point game. I think the moment that happened and Georgia had to throw because they were really behind and you were getting late in the game, everything changed because they are a run first team. I think, and we could touch on this a bit more too, we've been really critical about the fact that Georgia has not let Jake Fromm throw. And we talked about whether we had all video on whether Jake Fromm was overrated. I blame you for the title that drew myself a lot of criticism, but the the point there was more the fact that Jake Fromm was getting a tremendous amount of credit when he wasn't being asked to do very much. And I really felt like Jake Fromm played pretty darn well in the Auburn game. I didn't think the receivers played very well, and I don't think the passing game did very well. But I didn't really see it as being on Fromm. But the trick is, with the weapons they have at the skill positions right now, they don't need to be in a situation where they're forced to stretch the field vertically. They need to let Fromm be a game manager. So if they got back in that game and they play it closer, and they're going to be in the Georgia Dome, which is going to be basically a home environment, I think it's a very different game. I think Fromm's going to be a lot more comfortable. I think Georgia can run the ball a lot better than they did against Auburn. Auburn hadn't really stopped the run to that level all year. I think that was uncharacteristic. I think the fact that Trey Williams is hurt now for Auburn, if he's actually hurt, looks like he have a hurt shoulder. Wouldn't shock me if he can't make it back to the SEC championship game. I think that's a pretty big impact because Williams is such a thumper. I'll close with one last point there. I was looking in for the Iron Bowl, trying to watch a lot of snaps to see exactly what Williams was doing and how he was being used. And the thing that was interesting to me is I went back and watched Georgia game to try to get a better grasp of certain things. And early in the game, they had Williams in because Georgia was in a lot of run heavy sets and they were doing a lot of specific stuff with him. But as that game progressed, Williams wasn't even on the field because they were running outside linebackers, Atkinson, Darrell, to play basically a pass first set, and they were sitting in dime the whole time. And it dawned on me watching that to realize just how much Georgia was forced out of their game plan because Auburn didn't even feel like they needed to have their 240-pound starting middle linebacker on the field. That at that point, Georgia had gone to so much of a hurry up and try to catch up offense. If they get out of that, they have a chance to hit the reset button. They can play him straight up. Auburn doesn't have Williams. Georgia can try to be a run game, and if they can get that established, I think it's absolutely possible that they could beat Auburn.
All right, let's go 90 seconds on the flip side of that. We've opened real positive on Georgia. I know there's a lot of varying factors at play, but how worried are you if you're a Georgia fan seeing what Notre Dame did against Miami on the same day that Georgia got handled?
I think you have to be really concerned that Georgia completely stopped Notre Dame from running the ball in that game. They had 1.5 yards per carry. And to this point in the season, we felt like that was something that was absolutely absurd because Notre Dame had been averaging 6.7. Miami held Notre Dame for 3 yards per carry. Wasn't as much as Georgia, but that was a sign that maybe Georgia's run defense wasn't quite on par. I'm not so freaked out about a lot of things in that game. It's interesting to me because Notre Dame's passing game was, we actually modeled that, was almost exactly what we predicted. The problem was they had about half their predicted rushing yardage. It was only about 40% of our prediction. And that was an indicator that maybe Notre Dame, maybe it's a one-off, and I get that too, but I think to a large degree, our model sort of misunderstood what a good run defense would look like against Notre Dame. And when I say that, I'm going to be really honest here, since I was just very positive. There are some signs that Georgia's run defense is a problem. Georgia gave up 4.78 yards against Mississippi State. They gave up 4.46 yards against Florida. They gave up 5.15 against Auburn. I don't think anybody really would be surprised that if you give up 4.8 against Mississippi State, 4.5 against Florida, you would do slightly worse against Auburn and give up 5.15. Um, Maybe in retrospect, holding Notre Dame and Samford and Tennessee and Vanderbilt and Missouri and South Carolina all to under 3 yards per carry had more to do with those other teams than it did with Georgia's strengths. So I do think you have to be concerned with the Notre Dame game. I think when you look at it in context, we now have a picture that maybe Georgia's run defense isn't actually quite as dominant as we thought it was. And circling it around, because we are talking about the Georgia Tech game, it's an interesting data point when you're about to face a triple option offense.
And that leads me to something I like to do, and that's to force you to go down a path that you may not want to go down or may not truly believe in. But let's talk about, since we're probably both going to say Georgia's going to win this game. The numbers are probably going to say Georgia's going to win this game, but we haven't seen them yet. If we're talking on Sunday about a close game or a Georgia Tech win, tell me what happened in that game for that to occur.
I think Georgia's most notable weakness is if you can get outside the linebackers into the second level. We sometimes you see this with football teams, especially in college. You can have issues with size or strength at certain positions to get masked because you're so good at other positions. And a lot of teams aren't really capable of isolating it. The one thing the triple option is really darn good at doing is it's going to force every player on the field to make a play. And guys like Lorenzo Carter can make big negative plays and make a big impact defensively, but there are ways in the triple option to give him an assignment such that he can't do anything on the field because he's stuck doing his job covering his guy. The first thing and the obvious thing in any triple option game is if you don't do your job, it doesn't matter how good you are, you can be made to look silly. But I think the next thing is Georgia Tech is going to be able to get some runs, more than likely, out to the corners and safeties on Georgia. And I did not feel like the perimeter players from Georgia really showed up to be overly great players in that Auburn game. I thought that was the biggest thing that got them exposed, was that the Georgia defenders in the second level just struggled athletically when they were really, again, that Auburn offense was able to isolate them a little bit. And without really being helped so much by the front seven, where every play was a struggle and they could just sort of sit there and wait for it to come to them. They got out physicaled and outran on a number of occasions. They got out jumped for a touchdown. And Georgia Tech's going to do that. They're going to get to the perimeter. You've got to tackle in space. You've got to be physical and get off blocks. And I'm not saying it will happen because you've forced me in the position of saying what happens if it does. If they are successful, I think to a large extent it's going to be that Georgia's second level players keep getting isolated and they have corners and safeties that miss tackles, and it ends up going for long plays.
All right. What we've been trying to do lately is get into the model quicker. So why don't we go ahead and show the model? Tech fans don't really know much about our model, so go 60 seconds on what the model does, and then let us know what the model tells us and what the score is.
So my model for you nerdy tech math guys like me is it is a per play statistical model that looks at historical data to try to project future results. And the way it works is we look at all your opponents, we run the per play averages for your opponents, we look at your performance against the opponents, and we figure out what your percentages allowed were comparative to opponent averages. Meaning, if your opponent averages 6 yards per carry, overall, and you average 4 yards per carry, you give up 75% of opponent averages. That's the simple version of it. And then based off that, we project how you're going to do in a yardage sense in this game versus your opponent's strengths and weaknesses, run and pass. And then we look back at points scored and per play averages and project, okay, if I have this yard per play total and I look at my history, what kind of point production have I been able to produce with that? We tend to plot it on a curve because if you have 4 yards per play, you may score 20 points. And if you get 6 yards per play, you may score 60 points. I mean, it isn't a linear line. There's a certain point where suddenly offenses stop working, and there's a certain point where they're dominant. And it varies team for team for a lot of variables. So in this instance, with these two teams, I think the notable thing here is Georgia allows teams to a 76% of opponent rush averages. Georgia Tech allows teams to 111% of opponent rush averages. Frankly, we could almost just stop it right there. If Georgia is a dominant run defense against a triple option team, that's a very good thing. Georgia Tech not being able to stop the run against this Georgia rushing attack, really not a good thing. If you look at pass defenses, Georgia's pass defense, 78% of opponent averages. That's actually excellent because it's a lot easier to make an impact against the run than the pass. Georgia Tech, probably a little bit underrated there. I mean, they're 89%, right at 90% of opponent pass averages. That's not phenomenal, but that's actually pretty darn good. And, they may not have faced a murderer's row against the pass. It's actually surprising that Georgia Tech's average passing component is worse than Georgia's, frankly, because we've talked a lot about how bad the SEC East is passing the ball. But yeah, I mean, that's where you get, and it really just comes down to the run games. I mean, Georgia's expected to be able to run for 6.5 yards per carry. Georgia Tech's expected to average 4.2. 4.2 over 3 plays may be a first down, but the problem is the moment you get a negative play, the moment Lorenzo Carter tackles a guy for a yard, you don't average enough to make 9 yards up in the next 2 plays. And that causes drives to stall. And for that reason, you get a 34-17 result where Georgia, 7 yard per play, do a lot what they want in offensively. But give Tech some credit. I mean, 17 points isn't bad. And that's actually going to be one of the more productive outings offensively against Georgia's defense. Probably, again, that's a statistical expectation. So even though 17 points 34-17 may be a game where Georgia wins late, and people may sort of freak out about that a little bit, but it's not out of line from even the dominance Georgia's had throughout the season.
So we saw something interesting with Alabama and Mississippi State a couple of weeks ago, where Mississippi State was able to have some success running the ball, especially running the ball on third down, or at least converting on third down, and playing a really intentionally shortened game where they were snapping the ball at 2 or 3 seconds every offensive snap, and really limited the number of possessions that Alabama had. Could Georgia Tech do something similar and have success against Georgia? And talk about the potential downsides of employing that kind of strategy.
I mean, that's actually a pretty interesting question, right? I mean, what happens if offensively Georgia doesn't have a lot of snaps? And we talked a lot in the Alabama-Mississippi State game. Again, maybe Georgia Tech nerds can appreciate this. When you shorten the game, you increase the effective chance and probability. And the simple example is if you're rolling a dice and you need to roll a 1 or a 2 to win, you roll it once, you got a 1 in 3 chance. If you take the best of 5, that drops dramatically. If you take the best of 100, it's going to be less than 1% chance. It's almost impossible to make it more often than not. So the shorter the game, the more you have a shot of winning, and the more chaotic the results are going to be. So shorter games favor the underdog in the sense that, are you likely to win? No. Maybe if you have a 1 in 3 chance of winning, you still have a 1 in 3 chance of winning. But the shorter the game, the more it is truly a 1 in 3 chance toss up. And the longer the game, the more the better team. Over time, sort of a regression to the mean concept. You start, it all balances out in the end. And you see a lot of those games where the big team struggles for 3 quarters in the end of the game. People talk about depth taking over, and there's a lot of truth to that, but it's also a little bit that there's 3 of those, 2 out of 3 times they never struggled at any point. And the third time they struggled early, but regardless, they always have a quarter where they pull it together. The longer you go, the more eventually they kind of have things click and everything works out. So if Georgia Tech shortens the game, if they make it that sort of game where, it's just a few possessions here or there, then all of a sudden, maybe if they played 15 possessions, Georgia's going to outscore them. But maybe if they only play 8, well, maybe they get lucky. Maybe they spring a couple big plays in those eight possessions. Maybe Georgia turns it over once or twice, and that lucky roll gets to you. And I think it's notable you say this because neither one of these teams runs a lot of plays. Georgia this year, because they're so run heavy, they haven't ran many plays. I mean, their offensive yardage has been kind of dominated by the run. And when I say that, I mean, I think every other possession for Georgia, if you took two possessions, the first possession would be 3 runs, and the second possession would be 2 runs and a pass. That is their average because they're so heavily run to pass. And in terms of total plays run, Georgia's 98th nationally. Georgia Tech is 105th. So these are both teams that will run out the clock in the course of a game. They're playing each other. Georgia's probably going to want to shorten the game. On top of that, this could end up being a really impressively short game that that does add a little bit of chaos, and which is good because again, Georgia Tech has a little bit of an issue in that they're going to be outmatched in the ground.
So based on what you've seen, I know we talk about how, we don't always adhere directly to the numbers. A lot of times we sort of deviate. Based on what you saw kind of with Georgia coming out against Kentucky this past week, could you see them still being kind of angry and salty and trying to prove to everybody they're still around and making a run at a blowout here? Or is this going to be one of those short, grindy kind of games that they just got to get out of it and win?
I think they're still going to have a pretty good amount of teen angst that they got to work out in this game. It may not be to the same extent that it was against Kentucky, where it seemed like a kind of bloodletting, but it's an intense game, and I think it's notable, right, that Georgia Tech has won 2 of the past 4. Georgia is going to be keenly aware of that. All these players are aware of the fact that Georgia Tech won last year. They're not going to take this game lightly, and these games have consistently been close. We haven't seen Georgia dominate this game since the Georgia team that nearly played for the national title in 2012. I think that changes this year, and I think it's really impressive, the change in mindset of Georgia, and I think it's telling of where they had been for the past several years under Richt, that they're able to dominate in a way that they just haven't been able to. And I think this Georgia Tech team is okay. Frankly, this just isn't the best Georgia Tech team we've seen. They're not quite up to the standards that they have been over the past few years. I mean, they're solid and they're not terrible. And we've seen a bad Georgia Tech team, but we've seen bad Georgia Tech teams take it to Georgia. And I don't think this Georgia team is going to struggle with an average Georgia Tech team. If this was a good Georgia Tech team or a ranked one from 3 years ago, it's a different discussion. But this year with these teams, Georgia just does a better job of putting away teams that aren't quite on their level.
So what's your score for this one?
I'm going to go a little bit worse than the model, actually. I think this one's going to be, I'm going to go probably 41-17. I do think Georgia Tech's going to put up some points. I just, with all the way things work, I don't think they're getting great play from the quarterback position right now. And Georgia's going to be too keenly aware of the fact that they lost this game last year. So I do think 41-17 is a fair prediction.
So for me, I think Georgia Tech is going to be somewhat successful shortening the game early. And it's just such a hard look when you don't practice week in and week out to face that option attack. So with that, I don't think Georgia gets into the 40s. But I don't know that they give up 17 either. So give me 33-10 Georgia. And look, I think that people are writing off Georgia because of the optics of the score in the Auburn game without realizing, like you said, a couple of things go here or there, and that's a completely different ball game. Fromm missed by a hair a wide open bust from Auburn secondary in the
Riley Ridley. I think
it was. I mean, he'd have walked in, and then like you said, they missed a field goal in the first half. So 17, 14, or 15, whatever Auburn had at the half, they'd be losing. That's a completely different game. And then, like you said, the fumble and the punt. So I do think Auburn was the better team that day. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think it was. They were so much better that we're going into, if Auburn wins against Alabama, we're going into Atlanta thinking, okay, they're going to walk away with it, or that it's even assumed win. I honestly think the spread would probably be like 6 or 7 points. But yeah, you take those few plays and then the one ridiculous arm reach Darius Slayton catch in the end zone. You take those 3 or 4 plays away, and Georgia's got probably a significant lead. So I'm rambling. I've already given my score. I get a little frustrated when the SEC teams are outside of the SEC. Everybody looks for every single reason to just absolutely pick apart the SEC, but they don't apply the same nitpicking to the rest of the conferences. So here we're talking about maybe Miami and Clemson getting into the college football playoffs when Clemson has a loss to a 4-7 football team and Georgia has a loss to Auburn. I mean, it's just crazy to me. So I think that it's too soon to write off Georgia. And I know I'm saying stuff that's obvious because Georgia controls its own destiny, but I think people are sleeping on Georgia and they shouldn't. They put together too good a season this year to just completely count them out. Anything else on Georgia Tech?
Nope.
Well, Georgia fans, we'll be seeing y'all next week since you've already punched your ticket to Atlanta. Alabama or Auburn, we don't know who your opponent's going to be, but for this one, give us your score predictions. We're going to chat it up with you in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.